Amazon spent $11.6 billion to compete with SpaceX, but it did not build a single rocket. It did not launch a single satellite. It bought something SpaceX can never build: the radio frequencies that connect every iPhone on Earth to space. This is the story of how the most expensive acquisition in satellite history was not about satellites at all, and why it follows a pattern that has reshaped global communication twice before. In 1858, a copper cable was dropped to the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. It weighed more than a fully loaded steam locomotive, and it connected two continents for the first time in human history. Messages that once took 10 days by ship could now cross in minutes. Queen Victoria sent a telegram to President James Buchanan. Newspapers called it the eighth wonder of the world. The company behind it, the Atlantic Telegraph Company, became one of the most valuable enterprises on Earth. But that cable failed after just 3 weeks. The insulation broke down. The signal went dead. Investors who had staked their savings on the venture watched the value of their shares collapse overnight. It took 8 more years before a reliable replacement was laid, and by then, the competition had already started. Western Union and the Anglo-American Telegraph Company raced to lay rival cables across every ocean they could reach. By 1890, a web of undersea wires connected 6 continents. Whoever controlled those cables controlled global commerce, controlled information, controlled power. The pattern was unmistakable. A new communication technology appears. One company dominates first. Then a rival emerges, and the fight over infrastructure reshapes the entire economy. That pattern repeated almost exactly a century later. By the 1970s, AT&T had controlled American telecommunications for nearly 7 decades. 1 million employees, 150 million phone lines. Every long-distance call in the country ran through their network. They set the prices. They owned the wires. They decided who could connect. Then a small company called MCI did something no one expected. They filed an antitrust lawsuit, and they won. In 1984, the United States Department of Justice broke AT&T into 7 pieces. The press called them the baby bells. The competition that followed cut long-distance prices by 40% in under a decade. New companies rushed in: Sprint, WorldCom, dozens of others. And the infrastructure they built became the backbone of the commercial internet. Every generation, the same story plays out: a new medium, a monopoly race, a challenger. Satellite internet is the latest chapter. SpaceX launched its first batch of Starlink satellites in 2019. By early 2026, the constellation had grown to more than 10,000 satellites in low Earth orbit, 9 million paying subscribers, contracts with the United States military worth hundreds of millions of dollars, operations in over 60 countries. For a fishing boat captain off the coast of Indonesia or an aid worker in rural South Sudan, Starlink was not a tech product. It was the first reliable connection to the outside world. No other company was even close. Starlink had become the most dominant force in low Earth orbit since the space race. Amazon announced Project Kuiper in 2019, the same year Starlink began. Jeff Bezos committed $10 billion to building a rival constellation. But by 2026, Kuiper had launched roughly 200 satellites. SpaceX had 10,000. The gap was enormous. At that pace, it would take Amazon decades to catch up through launches alone. Then, on April 14th, Amazon made a move that changed the math entirely. $11.6 billion for Globalstar. Globalstar was not a startup. It had been operating satellites since the late 1990s, but it had struggled financially for years, caught between larger competitors and limited commercial demand. What Globalstar did have was something far more valuable than hardware: L-band spectrum. Spectrum is the range of radio frequencies that satellites use to communicate with devices on the ground. It is finite. It is regulated by governments. And once a company holds a license, competitors cannot simply build their way around it. Globalstar's spectrum licenses covered frequencies essential for direct satellite-to-phone communication. Apple had already chosen Globalstar to power the satellite connectivity feature in every iPhone and Apple Watch. When Amazon bought Globalstar, it did not just acquire satellites. It acquired the radio frequencies that connect 1 billion Apple devices to space. Think of it this way. In the 1800s, the US government gave railroad companies vast tracts of public land to incentivize building tracks across the continent. Those land grants were worth more than the railroads themselves. The companies that held them controlled the geography of American commerce for generations. Spectrum is the land grant of the 21st century. Amazon just bought the most valuable parcel in orbit, and with it, a direct line to every iPhone on Earth. What does a satellite internet duopoly actually mean? Start with price. When MCI challenged AT&T in the 1980s, long-distance calling rates fell dramatically. A 3-minute call from New York to London dropped from more than $10 to less than $1. Competition works. Starlink currently charges $120 a month for residential broadband. If Amazon's Kuiper constellation reaches full deployment, that price has nowhere to go but down. Then consider scale. Roughly 3 billion people on Earth still lack reliable internet access. Satellites can reach them. A teacher in a village in Niger, a clinic in the Solomon Islands. For them, the difference between one provider and two is the difference between a price they can afford and one they cannot. There are also military implications. Starlink has become critical infrastructure for the US Department of Defense. It provided communications in Ukraine. It supports operations in remote theaters where ground-based networks do not exist. A second provider gives the government leverage, options, and redundancy. And then, there is the question no regulator has fully answered. Who governs spectrum in space? The frequencies that Globalstar holds are licensed by the Federal Communications Commission. But satellites do not stop at national borders. The regulatory framework for a global satellite internet duopoly does not yet exist. Amazon's total capital expenditure for 2026 is projected at $200 billion, the largest single-year infrastructure investment in corporate history. $200 billion. That number tells you this is not a side project. This is Amazon betting its future on owning infrastructure that governments and consumers will depend on for decades. SpaceX, meanwhile, is reportedly preparing an initial public offering that would value Starlink alone at more than $200 billion. Two companies, $200 billion each. One sky. The pattern from the 1860s to the 1980s to today is consistent. Infrastructure monopolies feel permanent. They are not. But the transition period, the years when a challenger rises and forces competition, determines who profits for decades and who gets left behind. The telegraph cables made fortunes for those who laid them first. The AT&T breakup created an entire generation of telecom wealth. The satellite race will do the same. The question for this decade is not whether Amazon or SpaceX will win. Both will likely survive. Both have the capital to sustain losses for years. The real question is whether a duopoly in space is better or worse than the monopoly we have now. History suggests competition drives prices down and innovation up. But history also shows that competition eventually consolidates. AT&T was broken apart in 1984. By 2018, through mergers and acquisitions, it had reassembled most of itself into a company nearly as large as the original. In 1858, the question was who would own the cables under the ocean. In 1984, it was who would own the phone lines across the country. Today, it is who will own the signals falling from the sky. Every generation gets the same question. This generation has not yet answered it.